The penthouse was always silent, just the way Minjae liked it. Aaliyah kept her head down, a shadow in a black uniform, scrubbing the remnants of a life she wasn't allowed to touch. She thought she was invisible. She was wrong. A cold, calloused hand cupped her jaw, forcing her gaze upward. Minjae didn't look angry. He looked focused. He reached out with a white silk handkerchief, worth more than her monthly rent, and began to methodically wipe the copper-scented smear from her cheek. Aaliyah froze, the breath hitching in her throat. "Sir, I can finish the floors. I just tripped." "You didn't trip," he interrupted, his voice a low, dangerous hum that vibrated against her skin. He leaned in, his neck tattoo stark against his white collar, his eyes searching the bruise blooming under her skin. "Tell me," he whispered, the tenderness of his touch clashing with the restrained fury in his eyes. "Who did this to you?" Before we begin, kindly subscribe. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and how this touched you. Aaliyah tried to pull back, her shoulder hitting the cold glass of the floor-to-ceiling window, but Minjae didn't let go. He didn't use force, yet his presence was a cage she couldn't escape. He tossed the blood-stained silk onto a side table as if it were trash and stepped even closer, effectively pinning her against the view of the city skyline. "It was nothing, sir," she stammered, her hands twisting in the fabric of her apron. "Just a disagreement. It won't happen again. I'll be more careful to stay out of sight." "That is the problem, isn't it?" Minjae's voice was smooth, devoid of the bite she expected. "You spend so much energy trying to be a shadow. You think if you don't make a sound, you don't exist." He reached past her, not to touch her again, but to straighten a small vase of yellow primroses she had tucked into a corner of the kitchen island earlier that morning. They were cheap grocery store flowers, a small rebellion of color in his monochromatic world. "You bring these in every Tuesday," he said quietly. Aaliyah's heart skipped. "And when you think the shower is running loud enough to drown you out, you hum that jazz melody, the one about the summer rain." Aaliyah felt a flush of heat that had nothing to do with her injuries. The realization hit her like a physical blow. He hadn't been indifferent. While she had been playing the part of the invisible servant, documenting his life to avoid his path, he had been documenting her. I didn't think you were home for those," she whispered, her defense crumbling. "I am always home, even when I am not here," Minjae replied. He turned back to her, his eyes dark and fixated on the way she was trembling. "I noticed when you started wearing your hair tighter to hide the shake in your hands. I noticed when you stopped eating the lunch I leave for the staff. And I noticed the man who follows your bus to the stop every evening." The mention of her ex made the room feel ice cold. Aaliyah's breath hitched. She had worked so hard to keep her two worlds separate, the predatory terror of her past and the silent sanctuary of her work. Now the man who sat at the center of the city's most violent empire had reached across that line. "You are not a ghost, Aaliyah," his voice dropped to that lethal, protective register. "You are the only thing in this house that isn't a lie, and I do not like it when someone breaks what belongs in my house." He reached out, his thumb grazing the pulse point at her throat. "The invisibility is over. From now on, I see everything." The air in the kitchen felt heavy, thick with the scent of the expensive steak Minjae had prepared himself, a task he usually left to the invisible hands of staff. Aaliyah reached for her tray, her fingers trembling as she prepared to retreat to the small break room in the basement. It was her designated place, the boundary of her world. "Sit." The word was quiet, but it carried the weight of a physical barrier. Minjae was already seated at the head of the dark mahogany table, two plates set perfectly opposite each other. "Sir, I have to finish the laundry. The linens for the guest suite." "The linens can wait until tomorrow," he interrupted, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "Tonight, you are not a maid. You are my guest. Sit down, Aaliyah." It wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum wrapped in velvet. Aaliyah pulled out the chair, the heavy wood scraping against the floor with a sound that felt like a scream in the quiet room. She sat on the very edge of the leather cushion, her spine rigid. This was a violation of every rule she had lived by to keep herself safe. In her world, when powerful men took an interest, it usually ended in pain. Min-jae didn't eat. Instead, he reached across the table and held out his hand, palm upward. "Give me your arms." Aaliyah hesitated, her breath hitching. She tried to pull her sleeves lower, but Min-jae simply waited, his gaze steady and patient. Slowly, she placed her hands in his. His skin was warm, his grip firm but careful as he pushed back the black fabric of her uniform. The bruises were ugly, purple and yellow fingerprints blooming across her thin wrists where her ex had gripped her too hard the night before. Min-jae's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. He traced the marks with the pods of his thumbs, a gesture so intimate and reverent that Aaliyah felt a sob catch in her throat. "He did this while you were trying to leave," Min-jae stated, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. It wasn't a question. "I can still work," she whispered, her eyes pleading. "It doesn't hurt that much." "It should not hurt at all," he replied. He finally looked up, his eyes burning with a restrained, ancient fury. He didn't look at her with pity, but with a terrifying possessiveness. "Eat, Aaliyah. You need your strength for what comes next." "What comes next?" Min-jae finally picked up his wine glass, the dark liquid swirling like a storm. "Next, I ensure that no one ever lays a hand on you again. But first, you will finish your dinner." The following evening, the cramped hallway of Aaliyah's apartment building felt smaller than ever. The smell of floor wax and old brick was a world away from the cedar-scented air of the penthouse. When the knock came at the door, Aaliyah felt a jolt of pure adrenaline. She expected a phone call, perhaps a driver, not the man himself standing in her doorway, his expensive wool coat looking out of place against the peeling wallpaper. "Sir, you shouldn't be here. This neighborhood isn't safe for someone like you." "Then it isn't safe for you," Min-jae replied simply. He didn't wait for an invitation, stepping past her with a heavy bag in one hand. From the corner of the room, 6-year-old Zara peeked out from behind a worn armchair, her eyes wide as she took in the towering stranger. Aaliyah held her breath, ready to scoop her daughter up and run, but Min-jae's energy had shifted. The sharp predatory edge he carried in the underworld had been blunted into something steady and grounding. He knelt on the stained carpet, ignoring the ruin it might cause to his trousers. From the bag, he pulled out a stack of books, thick, beautifully bound volumes of fairy tales and illustrated histories. "You like stories," he said, his voice dropping to a gentle murmur that Aaliyah had only ever heard directed at her. Zara hesitated, then took a tentative step forward, drawn by the gold-leafed edges of the books. "Are you a king?" she asked, her voice small but curious. "Something like that, but I'm mostly a man who keeps his word." He handed her the top book, his hand steady. "In this story, the monsters aren't allowed to stay. They get sent away so the people in the house can sleep." Zara looked from the book to the man, then finally at her mother. She saw the way Aaliyah wasn't looking at the door in fear for the first time in months. Zara climbed onto the sofa, clutching the book to her chest. "Will you stay for tea? We have the kind with the yellow flowers Mommy likes." Min-jae looked up at Aaliyah, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a silent promise that made her knees weak. It was a bridge being built over a chasm of blood and secrets. "I'll stay," he told the girl, but his gaze never left Aaliyah. "And as long as I'm here, the monsters stay outside." Aaliyah realized then that she was no longer just a maid, and he was no longer just a boss. He had entered her sanctuary, and in doing so, he had claimed it. The rain hammered against the windows of the penthouse, but inside, the air was unnervingly still. Min-jae sat at his desk, the glow of a single lamp illuminating the files laid out before him. He didn't need to read them. He had already memorized the face of the man who had dared to bruise Aaliyah's skin. In Min-jae's world, debts were settled with interest, and a debt of blood was the most expensive of all. Aaliyah was in the other room, humming softly to Zara, unaware that the shadow hanging over her life was being systematically dismantled. Min-jae hadn't asked for her permission. He knew she would plead for mercy, her heart still conditioned by a fear that suggested survival was the best she could hope for. But Min-jae didn't want her to survive. He wanted her to be free. He picked up a sleek, encrypted phone and made a single call. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "The man from the bus stop," Min-jae said, his voice as cold as a winter grave. "He has reached his final destination. Make sure he understands why his journey ends tonight." Across the city, in a dimly lit alleyway far from the luxury of the penthouse, the language of the underworld was spoken. It was a language of heavy boots, sharp steel, and the absolute finality of power. Min-jae's men didn't miss. They didn't negotiate. They moved with the clinical efficiency of a predator removing a parasite. By the time the sun began to peek through the gray clouds, the threat that had kept Aaliyah looking over her shoulder for years had simply ceased to exist. Later that morning, as Aaliyah arrived to begin her shift, she noticed a change in the atmosphere. The heavy, suffocating tension that usually followed her from her apartment had vanished. For the first time, the walk from the bus felt light. She found Min-jae in the kitchen, staring out at the city. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear. When he saw her, his gaze dropped to her wrists, noting the fading bruises. "The ghost that followed you is gone, Aaliyah," Min-jae said, his voice a low, steady hum. She froze, a chill running down her spine. "What did you do?" "I spoke the only language he understood," Min-jae replied, stepping into her space. He didn't apologize. He didn't look guilty. He looked like a man who had cleaned a stain off his own floor. "You are safe now. That is all that matters." Aaliyah looked at his hands, the same hands that had gently wiped blood from her face and given books to her daughter. She realized then that his protection wasn't a gift. It was a storm, and she was standing right in the center of it. The peace Min-jae had bought her lasted exactly 48 hours. It ended not with a shadow in an alleyway, but with the sharp, rhythmic pounding of authority against her apartment door. Aaliyah's heart plummeted as she looked through the peephole. The flashing blue and red lights reflected off the grimy hallway walls, painting the peeling wallpaper in the colors of a nightmare. When she opened the door, 2 detectives stood there, their expressions as hard as the concrete outside. They weren't there for her ex. They were there because of what had happened to him. "Aaliyah Monroe?" the older one asked, his eyes darting past her to where Zara sat at the small kitchen table, her new gold-leafed book open in front of her. "We're investigating the disappearance of Marcus Thorne. Witnesses put a black sedan registered to a security firm in your neighborhood, a firm owned by Kong Min-jae." Aaliyah felt the air leave her lungs. The security Min-jae provided wasn't a shield, it was a brand. By erasing her monster, he had linked her to his own empire. "I don't know anything about that," she whispered, her voice cracking.
"Ma'am, if you're involved with people like Kang, you need to think about your daughter," the detective said, leaning in, his voice dropping to a warning hiss. "Men like him don't leave survivors, they leave crime scenes. If social services catches wind that a mafia boss is frequenting a home with a minor, you won't just be looking for a new job, you'll be looking for a lawyer to get your kid back." The door closed, but the silence that followed was deafening. Aaliyah turned to look at Zara, who was watching her with wide, confused eyes. For months, Aaliyah had survived by being invisible. She had traded that safety for the touch of a man who wiped her blood away with silk, only to realize he had replaced one predator with 1,000 others. The realization was a cold blade to the chest. Min-jae hadn't just saved her, he had claimed her. And in his world, love didn't lead to a quiet life, it led to a battlefield. She looked at the expensive books on the shelf, the beautiful stories of kings and monsters. She finally understood the truth. A king was just a monster with a crown, and his protection was a cage that would eventually trap her daughter inside. To love Min-jae was to invite the fire into the only home she had left. The penthouse was no longer a sanctuary, it was a gilded cage. Aaliyah didn't wait for the heavy doors to click shut before she threw the gold-leafed book onto Min-jae's mahogany desk. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. Min-jae didn't flinch. He remained seated, his white shirt crisp, his neck tattoo a dark reminder of the world he commanded. He looked up, his expression calm, but his eyes sharpened as he took in the fire in her gaze. "The police were at my door, Minjae," she spat, her voice shaking with a fury she hadn't known she possessed. "They didn't come to save me. They came to warn me that you are a death sentence for my daughter." Minjae stood slowly, his presence expanding to fill the space between them. "I removed a threat that was destroying you. I gave you peace." "You didn't give me peace. You gave me a debt I never asked for." Aaliyah stepped forward, refusing to be intimidated by his shadow. "You think you can just wipe blood off a face and own the person behind it? You treated my life like a stain on your floor that needed cleaning. But that monster you removed was my reality, and your protection is just a different kind of rope around my neck." "It is a rope that keeps you from falling," he countered, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous vibration. He reached out to touch her arm, but she recoiled as if his hand were white-hot iron. "It's a criminal rope, Minjae. It's built of blood and secrets, and it's pulling Zara into the dark with you." She took a jagged breath, her heart racing. "I spent years perfecting the art of being invisible so I could keep her safe. I'd rather be a ghost in a cold apartment than a queen in a graveyard. I don't want your money, I don't want your justice, and I don't want to be seen if it means the world sees me as your collateral."
Minjae's face hardened, the mask of the Mafia boss snapping back into place. "You think you can just walk back into the shadows? You know too much now. You are part of this." "No," Aaliyah said, her voice turning ice cold and certain. "I am the woman who cleans your floors, and today I'm finished. I'm choosing a life where I don't have to check the hallway for your enemies or the police. Keep your empire, Minjae. I'm taking my daughter and I'm leaving." She turned toward the door, her spine rigid. For the first time since they met, Minjae didn't move to stop her. He stood in the center of his vast, empty kingdom, watching the only real thing in his life walk away. The 3 days of silence that followed were louder than any argument. Aaliyah sat in her darkened living room, the city sounds outside feeling like a siege. She had packed their bags, but she hadn't left. She was waiting for a shadow that hadn't come. Then, at 2 a.m., a frantic, uneven pounding shook her door. She didn't check the peephole. She knew the weight of that knock. When she swung the door open, the man standing there wasn't the boss she knew. Minjae's white shirt was wrinkled, the top 3 buttons undone, and his hair, usually slicked back with clinical precision, was disheveled, falling over eyes that were bloodshot and raw. He didn't smell like cedar and expensive tobacco. He smelled like rain and desperation. He didn't wait for her to speak. He stepped into the cramped entryway and collapsed against the doorframe, his knees nearly buckling. For a man who lived by the rule of absolute control, he looked terrifyingly broken. "I can't go back to the silence," he rasped, his voice a jagged edge of its former self. "I tried. I sat in that house and all I could hear were the songs you hummed. All I could see were the flowers you brought into a place that didn't deserve them." Aaliyah stepped back, her hands trembling. "Minjae, go home. You're dangerous. The police." "Let them come," he interrupted, stumbling a step toward her. He reached out, not to claim her or pin her down, but with a hand that shook violently. He didn't touch her. He held his palms open, a gesture of total surrender. "You said my protection was a rope. You said I was a monster with a crown." He took a jogged breath, his gaze searching hers with a vulnerability that felt more intimate than his touch. "So take the crown, Aaliyah. I don't want to be the man who decides anymore. I don't want the power if it means I have to see you as a shadow." "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I am saying I am weak," he confessed, the words sounding like they were being torn from his throat. "For the first time in my life, I have a pulse, and it's beating for you. I will dismantle it all. The empire, the blood, the secrets. I will burn it down if it means I can stand in the light with you as a man, not a ghost." He sank to his knees on her cheap, worn carpet, the same way he had for Zara, but this time he was looking for his own salvation. "Don't make me go back to being a monster. Teach me how to be seen." In the dim light of the hallway, Aaliyah saw the truth.
The dangerous man had finally met the only thing he couldn't control, his own heart. Aaliyah didn't reach down to pull him up. Instead, she sat on the floor in front of him, leveling their gazes in the dim, flickering light of her small apartment. The power dynamic that had defined them, the hunter and the ghost, the master and the servant, cracked and fell away, leaving only two people in a wreckage of their own making.
"I won't be another one of your assets, Minjae," she said, her voice steady and steel-edged. "I won't be something you hide in a penthouse while you handle business in the dark. If I stay, it isn't to be protected, it's to be a partner. That means the blood stops, the secrets stop. You don't just protect my world, you join it." Minjae watched her, the raw desperation in his eyes slowly replaced by a profound, sobering clarity. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, not to command her attention, but to anchor himself. "I don't know how to live a quiet life," he admitted, the honesty of it a bridge between them. "I only know the language of force." Then we build a new language, word by word. The weeks that followed were a grueling metamorphosis. The process of going legitimate wasn't the cinematic montage of signatures and handshakes Aaliyah had imagined. It was a violent, bureaucratic war. Minjae began the systematic dismantling of his syndicate, severing ties with the underworld with the precision of a surgeon. He sold off the gray businesses, shuttered the fronts, and turned over ledgers to legal teams that had spent years fearing his name. He traded his silk suits for cotton shirts, and his late-night meetings for hours spent in her cramped kitchen, learning the names of the neighbors and the rhythm of a life that wasn't measured in threats. They sat together over paperwork for a new legitimate logistics firm, one that didn't move contraband, but the very flowers Aaliyah used to bring into his house. The transformation was painful. There were nights when the phone rang with threats from his former lieutenants, and nights when Aaliyah saw the old, lethal flash in his eyes as he fought the urge to settle matters with his fists. But every time the darkness rose, he would look at her, not as a maid, but as his equal, his conscience, and his North Star. They were merging two incompatible worlds, forging something new from the friction. For every secret he surrendered, she gave him a piece of her trust. They were no longer a boss and a maid. They were two architects building a foundation on solid ground, speaking a language where safety was no longer a lie. The golden hour light flooded the garden of the new house, a place of wide windows and open doors that sat far above the shadows of the city's lower streets. It was a home built on transparency, where no corner was left to the dark. Minjae stood by the terrace, his white shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing the dragon tattoo on his forearm. Once a symbol of a life lived in blood, it now looked like a relic of a past era, a scar that had finally stopped aching. He wasn't looking at a ledger or a weapon. He was watching Zara, now a confident young girl, racing across the lawn with a dog that barked at the setting sun. Aaliyah stepped out to join him, her hand sliding naturally into his. There was no hesitation in her touch, no ghost of the invisible woman who had once scrubbed his floors in silence. She was the CEO of their logistics firm, a woman whose voice commanded boardrooms with the same quiet strength she had used to save a Mafia boss from himself. "The school called," she murmured, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Zara won the debate competition. She has your stubbornness." Minjae smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes that were no longer haunted by the "who did this" fury of the past. "And she has your heart," he replied, squeezing her hand. "That's why she won." He turned to look at her, really look at her, in the way he had promised years ago. There was no black uniform, no split lip, and no need to hide. In the bright, unforgiving light of the late afternoon, he didn't see a servant or a victim. He saw his partner, his equal, and the architect of the peace they now inhabited. Aaliyah felt the warmth of the sun on her face and the solid weight of his presence beside her.
She remembered the girl who had tried to be a ghost, believing that safety was found in the shadows. She knew now that true safety wasn't being hidden, it was being known. The monsters were gone, not because they had been killed, but because the light had become too bright for them to survive. Min-jae had traded his empire for a legacy, and Aaliyah had traded her invisibility for a life where she was, at last, perfectly and beautifully seen. They stood together as the sun dipped below the horizon, not afraid of the coming night, because they finally knew how to carry the light between them.